Hey guys, happy holidays. As gamers, I'm sure that you've seen the wonderful Amiibos that Nintendo puts out of our favorite characters. The new ones for Tears of the Kingdom are pretty cool. Today, I am tackling if the exclusive items that come from Amiibos are canon in the game. This conversation is about more than what plastic figures drop meat, boxes, or that one really cool weapon. Specifically, I bring up the heavy lore implications involved with the Phantom Ganon armor in the Labyrinths. Believe me, this is one you don't want to miss. Now kick back and relax while I go over the topic. Let's talk about if Amiibo items are canon. Part 1. Are legacy items real? The term Amiibo is a bit limiting in this conversation, so allow me to broaden it to include items that were added in the DLC to Breath of the Wild. Collectively, I am going to refer to these as legacy items. These range to things like Tingle's outfit to Majora's mask, the goddess sword, and so forth. In Breath of the Wild, it was easy enough to explain these items away as they literally appeared magically without explanation. From an in-universe perspective, the undefined power of the Sheikah Slate would make items appear. Some of those objects would be legacy items that reference past games in the series, such as the various hero outfits, weapons, and even Epona. If these items were strictly contained to the use of these figures, then it would be easy enough to hand-wave them away as Easter eggs. Unfortunately, in Breath of the Wild, they started adding legacy items in ways that pull that into question. Some of my fellow theorists have used the existence of these items as proof of connections to past games in Tears of the Kingdom. But if you ask me, they seem to be basically little more than padding for the depths. I'll get to that a little later as I have a compelling reason why they are down there. With the DLC to Breath of the Wild and the inclusion of Misko the Bandit's treasures, an in-universe explanation for some of these items was created. Specifically that some of these items were stored in Hyrule Castle that Misko looted and hid throughout the land. Adding to the confusion is that these items stem across multiple timelines, from Wind Waker to Twilight Princess and even the original game. Some of the items are clearly stated to be replicas in their description. Given the conflict this causes, some of my fellow creators continue to write them off merely as metagame Easter eggs, with no bearing on the actual plot even with these few lines of dialogue. It is worth noting that these items don't have a compendium entry in Breath of the Wild either, merely a description when you pick them up or view them in your inventory. 4 items of note that we need to bring up are the Sheikah helmets for the champions, as these were introduced via their Amiibos in Breath of the Wild. These 4 items would not only be obtainable in Tears of the Kingdom, but have lore significance added to them. This causes a problem though, as they now exist in a capacity more than mysteriously falling from the sky in front of Link. So, going into Tears of the Kingdom, what did Nintendo do? As I said earlier, they sprinkled the items around the depths for padding. They also inflated this by making treasure chests for each one hidden in the sky. Many of them would also appear in the form of Misko's treasures, this time hidden away in their shrines in various caves. So, are these items real? If this were a year ago, pre-Tears of the Kingdom, even with the bit about Misko looting the castle, I would have absolutely written them off as DLC Easter eggs and nothing more. With the release of Tears of the Kingdom, it's a lot harder to ignore them, especially when there are quests that involve gathering pieces of them. The weapons and shields even have compendium entries now. As such, I've had to conclude that the items are indeed real even though it doesn't make a lot of sense. Still, that doesn't mean that they are the smoking gun that proves the 2 games are in the timeline. That is where the fun lies and what I have figured out, at least in theory. So let's move on to that next. Part 2. Are they replicas? First and foremost, we have to ask if these items are legitimately ones from the past games. It is very easy to show that they are not. A simple look at the Big Goron sword provides all the evidence you need. Or, as you might recall, you could buy a Big Goron sword that would break after so many hits. Afterwards, you could still use the busted handle, but the weapon would still be broken. There is a quest chain in that game that will get you one that doesn't break. So what happens when we find the Big Goron sword in Tears of the Kingdom? Well, it doesn't have infinite durability, that much is clear. so it cannot be the same one from Ocarina of Time. Though you might argue that this one is just the weaker one that could break. That's fair, but what about other legacy items you can find? How about the hero sword from the first Legend of Zelda? You know, the "it's dangerous to go alone" one? That sword famously lets you shoot sword beams, and yet that functionality doesn't exist in these new games. The Bow of Twilight in Breath of the Wild shoots light arrows similar to the Bow of Light, and yet when we find it laying around on Hyrule Castle, you will notice that it has been renamed the Dusk Bow and now shoots normal arrows, though it has the exact same description from Breath of the Wild. Most of these items do, even the ones that have their names modified and shoved in the quest. My point being, the lack of mechanical functions to weapons and items from the past games is enough to cast doubt on them being legitimate items from the past. I am inclined to say they are mostly replicas, but there are a few that need to be brought up. The Dust Sword not only has its own lore despite being repurposed from the Sage's Sword in Breath of the Wild, which of course was the sword we famously saw Ganondorf being executed with, but it has its own backstory now firmly different than what we see from Twilight Princess. I actually think that the Dust Sword and the Sword of the Sages is interesting enough to warrant its own video, so for now I'm going to politely move it off the table. The Dark Link Tunic is a good one to bring up as you can get it from Kilton in Breath of the Wild. Its description clearly states that Kilton made it as a replica of the green outfit once worn by a legendary hero. The outfit can be obtained in Tears of the Kingdom from the Bargainer statues. A fitting place to get it if you ask me. The description has been updated but clearly states it is a replica. Then there is the Goddess Sword, or the White Sword of the Sky as it was renamed in Tears of the Kingdom. I've touched on this one in a past video, but I'll go over it briefly here. Basically, there is a quest to help the toppled goddess statue in the Forgotten Temple. This involves collecting dragon parts from the 3 dragons and offering them to Hylia at the Shrines of Virtue. When done, the statues send that power to help the mother statue. And then, once again, she will stand tall, giving you the sword as a reward. It is clearly not the same goddess sword that would have been used to make the Master Sword. I don't think that this is a replica like the rest of the items though. I believe that this is a legit sword made from dragon parts, or maybe materialized from energy pulled from those parts. It could be that Hylia herself used a sword made in the same manner once upon a time. Another one that really calls out to me is the Majora's Mask we get as a reward for clearing out the Lynel-filled floating Colosseum. Its text specifically states it's an eerie mask passed down from ancient times. One might conclude that this is the same mask from that time, and yet at the end of Majora's Mask, the Happy Mask salesman is very clear that it has lost all of its power. In Tears of the Kingdom, this mask does seem to have some power to it. Monsters ignore Link while wearing it, and as my friend Moxie Watts pointed out, its eyes glow bright red when deep in the depths. To me though, this is just another replica for reasons I'll get into shortly. The biggest one that we need to talk about though is the Phantom Ganon armor, because there are a lot of crazy lore implications involving it. Before we get to that though, are you enjoying the video? If you are, a like and subscribe would be really appreciated. Maybe share this video with your friends so it will gain some traction. I put out a video every week and it's free. Now, back to the theory. Part 3. The Phantom Ganon Armor. The Phantom Ganon Armor, or rather the Evil Spirit Armor as it is called in-game, is a bit more difficult to address. The armor appears in the Misko EX quest from Breath of the Wild DLC, and is specifically stated to have been stolen from the castle. The description of the 3 pieces are: some believe that this armor is inspired by a dark entity resembling the great king of evil himself. The problem though is that in Tears of the Kingdom, the armor appears in the Lome Labyrinth and actually has some deeper lore behind it. This produces a continuity problem that needs to be resolved in one of a few ways. The situation means that either A. Misko stole armor from Hyrule Castle, and then it and other ones were locked away in Zonai chests in the depths. B. The armors from the castle that were stolen were replicas of much older ones stored in the depths by the Zonai. Or C. Misko stealing relics from the castle is canon, but those relics are not necessarily the armor sets themselves. I am inclined to go with B here, because I think it is feasible that in the days at the end of the Zonai civilization, perhaps Rauru or Minoru would have shown some of their treasures to those who would become the royal family. As such, replicas could have been made. Let me be clear. I think the stuff stolen from the castle along with the other armors we find in the depths are replicas, and not the legitimate items from past Zelda games. The evil spirit armor in the labyrinths, on the other hand, that I believe is legitimately from Phantom Ganon we see in Ocarina of Time, specifically the adult timeline branch. In Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf created a phantom of himself to guard the forest temple. Link confronts this entity and defeats it after a game of Dead Man's Volley, not to mention a few generous hits from the Master's Sword to its face. When defeated, its body floats up into the air and Ganondorf himself speaks. What a worthless creation that ghost was. I banish it to the gap between dimensions. This is a very ominous line, the gap between dimensions. I've had this line translated to ensure its context isn't being distorted. What I found is that the text was translated very directly, but it basically says the same thing. My friend, Low-Roll Historian, translated it as, "Anyway, this guy's pathetic. Vanish now to the space between dimensions." The implications from the visuals imply that the Phantom is traveling through the paintings in the battle by shifting out of phase with this dimension. As such, Ganondorf basically threw him into one of the same vortexes we can see forming under the creature. It is my belief that the evil spirit armor we get in Tears of the Kingdom is actually the same armor from this Phantom. When Ganondorf threw it into the void, it ended up drifting into a different dimension entirely. A different timeline, if you would. I believe it ended up in the ancient past of Breath of the Wild, long before Rauru and his sages. The armor pieces would have drawn the attention of those of this era because of two distinct things. One, it was obviously dark powers, something that might even resemble a demon, and a powerful one at that. The second is that it may have had a subtle hint of a specific power on it, that from the Triforce of Power. Consider that when Ganondorf created his Phantom, he had the Triforce of Power. It was amplifying his magic, so perhaps its golden touch could be recognized by the Zonai. This is a bit of speculation, obviously, but it fits. Let's say that this theory is true, that this evil armor drifted across dimensions and ended up here. What would they do with it? They chose to seal it inside of the labyrinths, perhaps a decision made while the structures were still being constructed. I personally don't think that they were constructed for that sole purpose. They just needed a place to safeguard these pieces of armor, and the labyrinths were convenient. But how does this relate to the other legacy armors that we see in the game? It's very simple. If this armor is truly from another dimension, then not only would the Zonai be potentially aware of the events of Ocarina of Time, but of its past with Skyward Sword and its three potential futures. In other words, this situation could have given the ancient Zonai the information needed to see the past and future of that timeline, to see how the Triforce and all three outcomes would be misused in the hands of mortals. They would also learn of the heroes who rose up to fight back, and thus now we have a potential explanation for why the Zonai created replicas of the various heroes and objects throughout the franchise. Part 4. Lingering Questions. One of the biggest questions of the game is that, if the depths predate basically all of Hyrule's civilization, over at least 10,000 years, then how would they replicate these various heroes' equipment and hide them there? I just outlined how they could have gained knowledge of it, so why create these pieces of armor at all, especially given that the anatomy of the Zonai differs so much from Hylian's? Perhaps they were simply that inspired by what they had seen. Or perhaps they came to realize their civilization was coming to an end. We don't know how the ancient Zonai viewed Hylians, but perhaps these events showed them that the Hylians and the other races would eventually inherit the land. We can't possibly know their motivations, but we know the outcome. They created suits of armors, the weapons, and as their days were drawing to an end, placed them in their minds deep underground. They included maps in the sky so perhaps one day a person could track down the armor. I ultimately presume that they were inspired by the deeds of those heroes from another timeline. As for how some of those replicas ended up in the possession of the royal family, that is a lot harder to justify, but it would seem that there has always been connections to the depths. The Sheikah built structures that rose up from there after all, and the 5 huge pillars around the castle were stated to be very deep underground. I think it is possible that in the days of the Sheikah preparing for the calamity, that they went down and discovered a great many things, which may include some of the armors that the Zonai had crafted. That reasoning works well enough for all the armors except the evil spirit armor, the one that they had sealed in the depths within the labyrinths. In that case, I think it is in the days of Roru. The evil spirit armor may have been shown to a few Hylians such as Sonia, and from there a replica was made. Because at the end of the day, it is about the only thing that makes sense why a set of it would be in Hyrule Castle. Part 5. The Split Timeline. Fans of my channels know I believe Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are their own continuity. A reboot of the franchise so the developers don't have to keep dealing with the baggage of the complicated timeline they created. And yes, they created it, not us fans. I'll avoid that tangent for another day. Go watch Zeltik or Bandit's videos on the topic if you're interested. I will link it in the description. What's important is that the situation is bad enough that people like myself wish they would either break away from the timeline entirely or just admit that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are a reboot, a reimagining. My old theory before Tears of the Kingdom came out was that with the Master Sword being left in the past at the end of Skyward Sword, that it somehow splintered a new timeline from those events. Some people have called this concept the Fubiyashi timeline, as he was the one responsible for Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. That basically, from the split, a timeline was built that would run parallel to the timeline we know and love. When this Ganondorf appears in the past of Tears of the Kingdom, it would be around the same time that Ganondorf from the original timeline appeared, but on this separate track. This would explain a lot of things. Why it is that this alternate timeline is more reminiscent of Japanese culture, potentially because the Zonai had a heavy role in crafting it. There is no question that the Zonai are indisputably powerful with their technology. We see evidence of this everywhere in the depths. We see that the sky was once filled with their islands, a lot more than what is present in the sky of Tears of the Kingdom, as debris of fallen broken islands can be found everywhere on the surface. To me, this seems like an alternate history, at best an alternate timeline. Perhaps the events of Skyward Sword really did play out. The Spring of Power certainly looks like the Skyview Spring after all. If that is the case, then it would imply that after the end of Skyward Sword, that the Zonai at some point appeared and basically created or aided some of the fundamental aspects of each of the races. If that were the case, then it would certainly seem that the Zonai are far more responsible for Hyrule than any of us ever imagined. Thanks for watching the video. I know last week I said I'd be making part 2 of the video about Zelda's depression, but unfortunately that video did not do very well. I am not yet big enough to do videos that are seemingly neglected by the algorithm. And so for now, part 2 of that video is on hold. Believe me, I want to tackle deep conversations like that. They are important. But at this point in my YouTube journey, I need growth for this to be sustainable. Once my basic needs are met, then I'll explore producing content that is less friendly on the YouTube platform. While giving this video a like and subscribe is always good, the best way you can help me get to the point where I can achieve that sustainability is by joining my Patreon or becoming a channel member. Speaking of which, I have my first official channel member. Thank you, Shauna Dorgello, for joining the crew. If you are interested in joining as well, you will gain access to my Discord where we can talk more directly about the content I create, along with your name joining these fine people down here. I love talking about these games and speculating about all this stuff, so join me for a conversation sometime. That's all I got for you today, guys. Be safe and may the way of the hero lead to the Triforce.